They say a prison of iron and steel can bury a man's life, but the truth is, the most ruthless prison is built by the betrayal of those who share your blood, the narrator stated solemnly, the words hanging heavy in the bleak morning air. The massive iron gates of the state penitentiary shrieked as they slid open, grinding against rusted tracks like the wail of a dying beast. Arthur Pendleton stepped out into the biting wind of the Kentucky winter. He was 72 years old. His face bore the deep, weathered crevices of an ancient oak tree that had survived countless merciless storms. His broad shoulders remained squared, refusing to hunch under the weight of the invisible chains he still carried. His hands were a brutal map of deep scars and thick calluses, hardened by 30 years of meticulous craftsmanship, building a family legacy, and then callously left to rot away during 20 years of silent decay in a 6-by-8-foot concrete cell. He did not look back at the looming guard towers. He was finally free. Arthur stood completely still on the gravel shoulder of the gray, endless highway. The bitter wind whipped through his thin, faded denim jacket, bringing the temperature down to a bone-chilling 35 degrees Fahrenheit. His entire existence, the sum total of a master carpenter's lifetime of sweat and devotion, was now reduced to what he held in his massive right hand. It was a cheap, clear plastic belongings bag issued by the Department of Corrections. Inside the crinkled plastic lay exactly $87 in worn, paper-thin bills. Beside the pathetic stack of cash rested a single, heavy brass key. He stared down at that brass key through the clear plastic. It was deeply tarnished, cold to the touch, and carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken ghosts. The memories rushed forward like a sudden avalanche, but they did not make him weep. Instead, they only turned his pale eyes into pieces of hardened flint. 20 years ago, the air inside his beloved cedarwood shop had smelled intoxicatingly of sweet pine, rich mahogany, and raw ambition. That was before the police cruisers had torn through his gravel driveway, their deafening sirens shattering the peace of his life forever. His own younger brother, Wallace, a man whose soft, manicured hands had never touched a piece of rough timber in his life, had orchestrated the perfect slaughter. Wallace had secretly fabricated a labyrinth of phantom construction contracts, forged Arthur's signature on a mountain of fraudulent bank loans, siphoned millions of dollars from their joint corporate accounts, and pointed a trembling, expertly rehearsed finger of blame on his older brother. Arthur vividly remembered the freezing steel of the handcuffs biting violently into his wrists right there beside his solid maple workbench. He remembered the arrogant, greedy smirk dancing on his perfectly shaved face as the judge's gavel fell like an executioner's blade. In a matter of weeks, Wallace had entirely consumed the Pendleton construction empire. Worse than the theft of his life's work, Wallace had mercilessly thrown Arthur's devoted wife Martha and his young, terrified daughter Clara out onto the unforgiving streets, stripping them of the family mansion with a cruel eviction notice while Arthur sat helpless behind iron bars. The humiliation had been a crushing, suffocating weight on Arthur's chest. To shield his wife and daughter from the venomous, judging whispers of the Blackwood County elites, Arthur had made a brutal, soul-destroying choice. He had sat down in the warden's sterile office, picked up a cheap plastic pen, and signed the official papers revoking all of his own visitation rights. He refused all incoming letters. He denied all phone calls. For 2 entire decades, he voluntarily vanished into an ocean of absolute suffocating silence. He swallowed the monstrous injustice without uttering a single scream, without shedding a single tear, choosing instead to let the endless years grind his bones into dust while he scrubbed floors in the prison laundry room. He chose the punishment of isolation so his family could distance themselves from a convicted felon.
The harsh roar of a diesel engine abruptly severed his dark thoughts. A rusted, exhaust-spewing bus pulled up to the desolate highway stop, its air brakes hissing loudly. Arthur stepped on board with slow, deliberate movements. He pulled his meager $87 from the plastic bag, carefully separating a few worn bills with his scarred fingers to pay the driver. He walked past the empty rows and took a seat in the very back corner. The bus lurched violently over the uneven asphalt. Arthur rested his heavy head against the cold, vibrating glass of the window, watching the barren, frozen landscape of rural Kentucky roll by in a blur of dead trees and gray skies. The highway stretched for miles and miles, a lonely ribbon cutting through miles of neglected farmland. He was heading back to Blackwood. The bus eventually hissed to a halt, dropping him at the very edge of the remote town, just as the weak sun began to sink below the jagged tree line. The familiar, suffocating fog of Blackwood County had already begun to roll in, swallowing the rusted street signs and dampening the sound of his heavy leather boots. The air here was heavy with moisture and the smell of decaying leaves. Arthur gripped the plastic bag tighter, his knuckles turning white from the cold. He had nothing left to his name but those $87, the clothes on his back, and the monumental silence buried deep within his chest. He dragged his weary, heavy feet along the cracked pavement, heading slowly toward the forgotten dead end of Cedar Road. He was walking toward the ruins of his old cedar woodshop, a place long abandoned to the mercy of termites and time, and the absolute last scrap of dirt the law had not managed to strip from his name. He moved through the thick fog with the slow, deliberate pace of an old ghost returning to its final resting place, completely unaware that for 2 agonizing decades that desolate, rotting structure had been concealing a staggering, earth-shattering secret, quietly waiting in the dark for the old Carpenter to finally come home.
The Blackwood County Courthouse loomed through the dense morning fog, its grand limestone pillars stained with decades of dampness, neglect, and the quiet despair of broken lives. Arthur stood at the bottom of the wide concrete steps, his faded denim jacket offering zero protection against the biting wind. The temperature hovered around 38 degrees Fahrenheit. A sleek, black luxury sedan glided smoothly to the curb, its tires crunching softly against the loose gravel. The heavy passenger door swung open. Out stepped Wallace Pendleton. Wallace was 65 years old, but his skin was meticulously pampered, stretched tight over a face that had never known a single day of brutal labor or honest sweat. He wore a tailored wool suit that cost more than a master carpenter's yearly wage, a stark contrast to the threadbare denim on Arthur's back, a silk tie resting perfectly against his chest, and an expensive gold watch gleaming arrogantly on his soft, unblemished wrist. He paused on the steps, his eyes locking onto the tall, imposing figure of his older brother, standing quietly in cheap prison-issued clothes. Still planning to crawl into that pile of rotting wood to wait for death, Wallace sneered mockingly, his voice dripping with condescension and venom. Arthur did not flinch. He did not scream. He did not curse the man who had mercilessly stolen his life, and he did not clench his scarred fists in sudden anger. He simply turned his head, his pale eyes sweeping over Wallace with the absolute, freezing indifference one might reserve for a meaningless speck of dust floating in the wind. The profound silence that radiated from the old carpenter was far heavier and far more terrifying than any verbal threat. Arthur kept walking. Inside the dimly lit clerk's office, the stale air smelled intensely of burnt coffee and rotting paper. Arthur approached the scratched wooden counter, his massive physical presence instantly causing the young clerk to sit up straighter in her chair. He asked for the current legal status of the small parcel of land at the dead end of Cedar Road, the exact location of his old cedar woodshop. The clerk typed rapidly on her keyboard, her eyes widening in genuine surprise as she read the glowing screen. The property had been completely abandoned, legally classified as a worthless pile of dangerous debris, and heavily burdened by decades of unpaid property taxes. The county had never even bothered to officially seize the land, simply because the sheer cost of hiring a demolition crew to safely clear the rotting timber would have far exceeded the miserable value of the dirt it sat upon. It was a piece of garbage. Arthur reached into his clear plastic bag. With agonizing slowness, his thick, scarred fingers pulled out the worn paper bills from his life savings of $87. He carefully counted out exactly $14, sliding the green money across the counter to cover the basic administrative processing fee required to officially reinstate his name on the deed. The clerk stamped the legal document with a loud thud, sliding a thin, flimsy piece of paper back across the scratched wood. The woodshop was his again. By the time Arthur stepped back outside, the weak afternoon sun had vanished entirely, quickly replaced by a suffocating blanket of pitch-black darkness and a bone-chilling cold. The temperature plummeted rapidly into the low 20s. He began his long journey on foot, his heavy leather boots striking the cracked asphalt in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He walked 3 miles. The arduous journey took him past towering pine trees, abandoned gas stations, and empty, barren fields that stretched out endlessly into the freezing night, the icy wind tearing viciously at his face and numbing his ears. He walked with the stoic endurance of a massive draft horse, unyielding, unbreakable, placing one heavy foot in front of the other, until the paved road finally crumbled away into a muddy, overgrown dirt path. There, at the very edge of the dark woods, stood the silent silhouette of his past. The woodshop was barely visible in the deep gloom. Its cedar siding was completely black with age, the roof sagging precariously under the crushing weight of forgotten decades, and the surrounding yard entirely choked with dead, thorny weeds that reached up past his knees. He walked up the wooden steps. They groaned violently under his immense weight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key. He slid the brass key into the heavily rusted padlock. It took a moment of brutal force, his thick arm muscles straining intensely against the oxidized metal, but the ancient lock finally yielded with a sharp crack. Arthur removed the heavy chain, letting it fall against the wooden planks with a dull thud. He braced his calloused hands against the heavy double doors, fully preparing his lungs for the overwhelming stench of decay, black mold, and decades of accumulated rat droppings. He pushed the heavy wooden doors inward. They swung open with a heavy groan. Arthur stepped over the threshold, the frozen wind rushing past his broad shoulders into the pitch-black abyss of the building. But instead of the vile odor of rot and absolute abandonment he had firmly braced for, a warm, unmistakable fragrance drifted out of the darkness. It was the rich, intoxicating scent of aged walnut wood and freshly rubbed linseed oil, so pure and perfectly preserved that the old master carpenter's heart suddenly stopped beating in his chest.
Arthur stood frozen just inside the threshold. The heavy wooden doors remained open behind him, letting the freezing Kentucky wind howl through the empty, overgrown yard. The temperature inside the dark cavern hovered stubbornly in the low 30s, chilling the air to a biting frost. Yet the atmosphere within the ancient walls was entirely still, heavy, and strangely sacred. Arthur reached deep into the pocket of his faded, threadbare denim jacket. His scarred, battered fingers retrieved a heavy brass flashlight he had found discarded in the dirt near the lonely bus stop. He pressed his calloused thumb against the heavy metal switch. A single, sharp beam of yellow light pierced the suffocating darkness. Arthur raised the heavy metal cylinder with agonizing slowness. He panned the piercing beam slowly across the high, vaulted ceiling of the structure. His sharp, meticulously trained eyes, the uncompromising eyes of a master structural engineer and a lifelong carpenter, swept over the bare architectural bones of the building. He systematically examined the massive, 10-inch thick overhead beams of rough-cut Douglas fir. He studied the intricate, hand-carved mortise and tenon joints he had painstakingly cut 30 years ago, and he traced the heavy roof trusses spanning 30 feet across the wide, cavernous room. The exterior cedar siding was undeniably rotting away from decades of harsh rain and brutal winter snow. The exterior roof sagged dangerously under the crushing weight of wet leaves and neglected seasons. But the skeleton was unbreakable. The core framing stood as solid and immovable as a mountain of solid rock, completely defying the passage of time. Arthur lowered the beam of light toward the wide wooden floorboards, firmly bracing his mind for the inevitable sight of absolute ruin. He fully expected to see mountains of dead, decaying leaves, the scattered, brittle skeletons of dead animals, and the chaotic, relentless destruction of nature violently reclaiming the forgotten space. The beam of light hit the floor. Arthur stopped breathing. There was not a single speck of dust. The wide, heavy oak floorboards had been swept entirely clean. The yellow light reflected softly off the meticulously maintained wood. Arthur walked forward slowly, his heavy, worn leather boots making soft, echoing thuds in the vast, overwhelming silence. In the very center of the room sat his massive, industrial-grade table saw. It was not a rusted, ruined heap of useless metal waiting for the scrapyard. It was draped perfectly in a heavy, waterproof canvas tarp, its stiff corners neatly folded and securely tied down with thick, heavy hemp rope. Arthur reached out. His calloused fingertips gently pulled back the heavy fabric. The heavy cast-iron top of the expensive saw was absolutely immaculate, rubbed down heavily with a thick, protective layer of hard paste wax to completely repel the dampness of the deep woods. He turned the flashlight toward the back wall. The massive wooden pegboard spanned 15 feet across the cedar planks. Arthur stepped closer, his pale eyes widening a fraction of an inch in the pressing darkness. There, hanging in absolute rigorous perfection, were the dedicated tools of his life. The high-carbon steel chisels with their turned ash wood handles, the heavy cast-iron smoothing planes, the delicate brass block planes, the razor-sharp dovetail hand saws, and the heavy brass mallets. They were all there, arranged with military precision. Not a single piece of forged metal bore the destructive orange stain of rust. Every single blade was gleaming. Every single handle was perfectly smooth. Someone had meticulously coated every square inch of exposed metal with a thin, protective film of premium machine oil, carefully conditioning the wooden handles with rich, sweet-smelling linseed oil. It was a painstaking, labor-intensive process that required countless hours of silent, back-breaking dedication. Someone had stood in this freezing, unheated building, year after agonizing year, fighting an endless, solitary war against the creeping decay of time and weather. Arthur lowered the flashlight. The yellow beam trembled ever so slightly in his massive, scarred hand. His weathered face remained a stoic, unreadable mask of deep dignity. He did not cry, he did not drop to his knees, but a profound, overwhelming warmth began to thaw the 20 years of absolute ice surrounding his battered heart, recognizing the undeniable presence of profound, unconditional loyalty. He walked toward the far corner of the room, his shadow stretching long and dark against the cedar walls. There, illuminated in the ambient glow of the flashlight, stood the undisputed heart of the shop. It was his masterpiece, a massive, solid maple workbench. He had built it 30 years ago, painstakingly gluing and clamping the dense, heavy hardwood together by hand. It was exactly 8 feet long, 3 feet wide, and stood perfectly level on the heavy oak floor. The solid maple top was exactly 3 inches thick, weighing well over 400 pounds, serving as an immovable altar dedicated to the solemn religion of hard, honest labor. Arthur rested his scarred palms flat against the cold wood. The surface was completely flawless. It had been aggressively hand-sanded, stripped entirely of the old accumulated glue and dark stains of his past projects, and rubbed out to a silky, glass-like finish. For 20 long years, while he rotted away in a miserable 6 by 8 foot concrete cell, believing the entire world had discarded him like a piece of worthless garbage, an unknown ghost had been quietly keeping his sanctuary alive. He slowly dragged his rough fingertips along the polished surface of the maple, tracing the beautiful, tight grain of the dense wood, silently absorbing the profound reverence left behind by the mysterious caretaker. He reached the very edge of the massive table. His thick, calloused fingers instinctively curled beneath the heavy, 3-inch overhang of the maple top, sweeping slowly along the dark, unseen underbelly of the wood, when his rough hand suddenly caught against a strange, uneven texture, a thick, hardened wood glue deliberately sealing a heavy, hidden wooden panel completely shut.
The first pale light of the morning bled through the cracked, dirty windows of the woodshop. The temperature outside had barely climbed to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving a thick white layer of frost over the dead weeds and the sagging cedar roof. Inside the massive structure, the air was bitter and sharp, biting deeply into the exposed flesh. Arthur did not care about the freezing cold. He had not slept a single minute. He stood in the center of the vast, quiet room, his heavy leather boots planted firmly on the pristine oak floorboards. He shed his faded, threadbare denim jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a nearby wooden crate. He wore only a thin, faded gray cotton shirt that clung tightly to his broad, heavy shoulders. It was time to work. He walked over to the immaculate wall of tools. His scarred, battered fingers reached out, closing firmly around the smooth, oiled ash wood handle of a heavy cast-iron block plane. The tool felt instantly familiar, incredibly heavy, and perfectly balanced, settling into his massive palm like a long-lost extension of his own physical body. He turned toward the back corner of the shop, where a stack of heavy, rough-sawn Douglas-fir tourists lay waiting. They had been sitting there for 20 years, patiently waiting for the master carpenter to return and finish the job. Arthur lifted a heavy 12-foot beam, a massive piece of timber weighing easily over 80 pounds, and hauled it onto a pair of heavy wooden sawhorses. The stoic labor began. He gripped the cast-iron block plane with both hands. He pressed the razor-sharp high-carbon steel blade against the rough, splintered edge of the massive fir beam, locked his heavy elbows, planted his worn leather boots firmly into the floorboards, and pushed his entire body weight forward with a brutal, explosive surge of raw physical power. The sharp blade bit deep into the dense wood. A long, perfect, paper-thin ribbon of pale wood shaving curled up from the throat of the plane, falling gracefully to the floorboards. The sound was beautiful. It was a loud, satisfying, rhythmic tearing sound, cutting cleanly through the absolute silence of the freezing morning.
Arthur pulled the heavy plane back. He pushed forward again. He repeated the brutal, back-breaking motion over and over, his massive chest heaving, his thick arms driving the heavy iron tool through the dense wood, stripping away the rough, ugly exterior to reveal the bright, untouched perfection hidden deep beneath the surface. He shaved beam after beam, correcting the warping, leveling the massive 10-foot joists, and preparing the structural timber to reinforce the dangerously sagging roof overhead. He worked like a machine. He did not pause for water. He did not pause to rest his aching 72-year-old joints. He simply worked. For 2 hours, the only sounds in the freezing cavern were the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the old man and the relentless, sharp bite of steel slicing through solid wood. Despite the freezing 28-degree Fahrenheit temperature, dark, heavy patches of sweat began to soak through the back of his thin cotton shirt. Thick beads of perspiration rolled down his deeply wrinkled forehead, stinging his pale eyes and dripping silently onto the scattered mountain of curly wood shavings piling up around his heavy boots. He was purging 20 years of absolute, suffocating stagnation through the brutal, unforgiving punishment of manual labor. Then a sound broke the rhythm. It was not the wind. It was the soft, unmistakable crunch of small shoes stepping onto the gravel driveway outside the heavy double doors. Arthur stopped immediately. He froze in place, his massive hands still gripping the heavy iron block plane, his broad chest rising and falling heavily with exertion. He turned his head slowly, his pale eyes narrowing intensely toward the open doorway. The morning fog was still thick, swirling softly into the woodshop, but through the gray mist, 2 small silhouettes slowly emerged. A young woman stepped over the threshold. She was exactly 24 years old. She wore a heavy, dark green wool coat, her long, dark hair pulled back into a simple, practical braid that rested over her shoulder. Her face was fiercely determined, carrying a quiet, unmistakable dignity. But it was the striking, undeniable bone structure of her jaw and the deep, soulful shape of her dark eyes that made Arthur's heart slam violently against his ribs. She looked exactly like her beloved daughter Clara had 20 years ago. Holding her left hand tightly was a tiny, bright-eyed little boy. He was barely 3 years old, bundled up in a thick blue winter jacket, wearing tiny work boots and clutching a brightly colored plastic toy hammer firmly in his right hand. The young woman stopped exactly 10 feet away from the heavy maple workbench. She stared at the massive, sweat-drenched old man standing amidst the pile of fresh wood shavings. Her dark eyes swept over his scarred hands, his weathered face, and his faded, prison-issued clothing. A profound, overwhelming wave of emotion washed over her face, but she did not break down. She stood tall, inheriting the exact same unbreakable stoicism that pulsed through the old carpenter's veins. "You came back," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, but completely devoid of fear. Arthur could not speak. His throat was completely paralyzed, locked tight by an invisible, crushing vice. He simply stared at her, his breathing slowing, his knuckles turning pure white as he gripped the iron plane. "My name is Evelyn," the young woman continued, stepping 1 foot closer, her voice carrying a heavy, quiet strength. "I am Clara's daughter. You are my grandfather." The words struck him like a massive physical blow. A granddaughter. He had a granddaughter. He looked down at the tiny 3-year-old boy holding the plastic toy hammer, staring up at the giant old man with wide, curious eyes. A great-grandson. The bloodline had survived, the family he had desperately tried to protect by banishing himself into an absolute ocean of silence had somehow endured the brutal 20-year winter of his absence. "Where are they?" Arthur finally asked. His voice was a deep, gravelly rasp. It was the absolute first time he had spoken a single word aloud since walking out of the state penitentiary. It sounded like two heavy stones grinding in the dark. Evelyn's strong jaw tightened. Her dark eyes pooled with heavy tears, but she absolutely refused to let them fall. She stood her ground, meeting his intense, piercing gaze with an unwavering, heartbreaking honesty. "They are gone," she whispered gently, into a perfect syllable of deafening silence. The entire world stopped spinning. Grandma Martha passed away 12 years ago from a second stroke, Evelyn explained, her voice remarkably steady despite the crushing weight of the tragedy. And my mother, Clara, she died of heart failure 3 years ago, right after little Leo was born. Arthur did not scream. He did not fall to his knees, and he did not wail into the freezing Kentucky air. The absolute, soul-crushing agony of the revelation struck him deep in the core of his chest, completely shattering the iron walls of his stoicism into a million silent, jagged pieces. He stood as still as a stone statue. He closed his pale eyes, dropping his heavy chin towards his chest, letting the devastating, suffocating silence wash over him. The two women he had loved more than life itself, the women he had sacrificed his own freedom to protect, had died without him. They had died in the cold, while he was locked in a cage of iron and steel, miles away. "You pushed them away to protect them from the shame of your trial," Evelyn said firmly, her voice echoing softly through the vast woodshop. "But they never abandoned you, not for a single day." Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at Evelyn, his chest aching with a pain far worse than any physical wound he had ever endured.
"When Wallace threw them out of the estate," Evelyn continued, pointing a gloved finger toward the far wall of the woodshop, "they moved into the tiny, forgotten caretaker's cabin at the very edge of this property. It was just 50 yards away. They lived right there, quietly, for 20 years. Evelyn walked slowly toward the back wall, her hand gently brushing against the perfectly oiled handles of the chisels. "Every single weekend," she said, her voice filled with a profound, overwhelming reverence, "Grandma Martha, even when her left arm was completely paralyzed from the stroke, would sit in that chair right there. My mother Clara would bring down the rags and the oil. They spent hours cleaning every single speck of rust off these tools. They swept the floorboards. They waxed the cast iron tops of the machines. I helped them do it when I was old enough to walk." She turned to Arthur, a sad, beautiful smile touching her lips. "I asked them once why we spent so much time cleaning a dusty, empty building," Evelyn whispered. "My mother looked at me and said, 'Because your grandfather is an innocent man, and he will need his tools ready when he comes home.'" Arthur's massive, scarred hands began to tremble. The absolute crushing weight of their unconditional love and their monumental sacrifice was too much to bear. He slowly placed the heavy iron block plane down onto the workbench. He took a slow, heavy step forward, completely closing the distance between himself and his granddaughter. He reached out with his thick, calloused fingers, gently touching the side of her face. Evelyn leaned into his rough, scarred palm, closing her eyes. Little Leo waddled forward, his tiny winter boots thumping softly on the floorboards. He stopped right next to Arthur's heavy leather boot and playfully tapped the thick leather with his bright plastic toy hammer. Arthur looked down at the boy. A deep, silent warmth flooded into his frozen veins, melting away the bitter 20-year winter of his soul. He was not completely destroyed. He was not alone. He took a deep, steadying breath, his lungs filling with the rich scent of cedar and linseed oil. The past was gone, but the present was standing right in front of him, and there was still work to be done. Arthur gently patted little Leo's head. He turned his massive body toward the solid maple workbench. He remembered the strange, hard ridge of wood he had felt under the heavy overhang the night before.
He reached up and pulled down a heavy, 1-inch wide bevel-edged steel chisel and a solid brass mallet weighing exactly 2 pounds. He knelt heavily onto the oak floorboards. Evelyn stepped closer, holding little Leo's hand, watching intently as the massive old man positioned himself beneath the 3-inch thick overhang of the heavy maple tabletop. Arthur slid the razor-sharp edge of the steel chisel directly into the narrow, glue-filled seam sealing the hidden wooden panel. He raised the heavy brass mallet. He struck the wooden handle of the chisel with a short, controlled, incredibly powerful blow. The sharp crack of brass striking wood echoed loudly through the quiet shop. He struck it again and again. He meticulously chipped away the hardened resin, moving steadily along the entire 30-inch length of the hidden compartment. Little Leo waddled over, mimicking the old man's rhythmic motions, gently tapping his small plastic hammer against the heavy wooden leg of the workbench. The old carpenter and the tiny boy worked together in absolute perfect harmony. With one final powerful strike of the heavy brass mallet, the thick layer of hardened glue finally shattered into pieces. The heavy wooden panel dropped. It fell away from the underbelly of the massive maple workbench, completely exposing the dark, hollow cavity hidden deep within the solid wood. Arthur reached his massive, calloused hand into the dark void. His thick fingers wrapped firmly around the cold, heavy handle of a large, fireproof iron lockbox. He pulled it out, resting the incredibly heavy iron container onto the smooth surface of the workbench. It was perfectly sealed, completely untouched by the dampness of the surrounding woods. Arthur stared at the heavy iron box, the absolute silence in the room returning with a deafening intensity. He did not know what his wife and daughter had hidden inside this heavy metal vault, but as he rested his scarred hands upon the cold iron lid, he felt a sudden, terrifying shift in the very air around him, because whatever lay sealed inside was not merely a collection of sentimental family memories, but a calculated, earth-shattering weapon of absolute destruction.
Arthur placed his massive, scarred hands on the cold iron latches of the fireproof lockbox. The heavy metal was chilled from decades of sitting in the dark, hidden cavity of the solid maple workbench. He pressed his thick thumbs against the stiff, oxidized locking mechanisms. They resisted fiercely for a fraction of a second before yielding with a sharp, echoing snap. He lifted the heavy iron lid. It groaned loudly on its thick hinges, slowly falling backward to reveal the incredibly dense, meticulously packed contents inside. A faint, heartbreaking scent drifted up from the dark interior, a delicate mixture of dried lavender, aged paper, and the undeniable essence of a home he had lost 20 years ago. Arthur looked down. He did not find gold, and he did not find stacks of hidden cash. Lying at the very top of the heavy iron box was a thick, chaotic stack of faded yellow legal paper. The pages were heavily crumpled, their edges worn soft from being handled countless times. Arthur reached in and gently lifted the stack. He held the fragile pages up to the pale morning light filtering through the dusty windows. The handwriting was completely unrecognizable. Instead of his wife's famously elegant, flowing cursive script, the blue ink on the yellow paper was violently jagged, deeply unsteady, and completely chaotic. The pen had been pressed down so fiercely in certain places that the sharp metal tip had actually torn through the fragile paper fibers. Page after page, line after line, the writer had painstakingly formed single, oversized block letters, completely filling the legal pads with the exact same agonizingly repeated sequence: A-R-T-H-U-R. Arthur stared at the jagged letters. His massive chest tightened, the air suddenly vanishing from his lungs. He looked up at Evelyn, his pale eyes silently demanding the devastating truth.
The stroke hit Grandma Martha entirely on her right side, Evelyn whispered softly, her voice thick with a profound, aching sorrow. It completely paralyzed her dominant hand, and it took away her ability to speak in full sentences. But every single night she would sit at the small kitchen table in the dark. Evelyn pointed a trembling, gloved finger at the yellow pages. She would strap a cheap plastic pen to her left hand with rubber bands, Evelyn explained, her dark eyes shining with intense, unbreakable pride. And she would spend hours completely exhausting her fragile body, just trying to write your name perfectly so she could mail it to the penitentiary. She just wanted you to know she was still waiting. Arthur stopped breathing. He looked back down at the jagged, torn blue ink. He could almost see his beloved wife sitting in the freezing, cramped cabin, her half-paralyzed body trembling violently in the dark, fighting through absolute physical agony just to form the 6 letters of his name. He did not cry. He did not let out a sound, but deep within his massive chest, the last remaining fragments of his hardened, stoic armor completely disintegrated into dust, replaced by an overwhelming, transcendent reverence for a love that absolutely refused to die. He gently set the yellow papers down. He reached deeper into the heavy iron box. Beneath the letters lay a thick, heavily worn, leather-bound diary. He opened the cover. This handwriting belonged entirely to his daughter, Clara. The pages were filled with incredibly dense, meticulous notes, long strings of complex bank routing numbers, and detailed names of obscure, out-of-state shell corporations. It was a hunter's journal. "My mother did not just sit around crying," Evelyn said firmly, her chin raised high. "She spent 15 years tracking every single dirty dollar Wallace ever moved. She worked as a low-level clerk at the county records office just to get access to the restricted archives." Arthur turned the thick pages of the diary. Beneath the leather book, resting at the very bottom of the heavy iron box, lay a thick, heavy manila folder, tightly wrapped in thick, waterproof plastic sheathing. Arthur carefully peeled back the heavy plastic. He opened the heavy folder. Inside lay an absolute mountain of lethal, irrefutable evidence. There were dozens of fragile, transparent spools of county microfilm. There were thick stacks of original, deeply ink-stamped bank transaction vouchers from 20 years ago. And there was the ultimate prize. Arthur pulled out 3 incredibly crisp, perfectly preserved sheets of heavily watermarked banking documents. They were the original, unredacted loan agreements that had completely been hidden from the federal prosecutors during his sham trial. Staring up at him, written in bright blue fountain pen ink, were the actual, undeniable signatures of his younger brother, Wallace Pendleton. The signatures perfectly matched the fraudulent transfers, definitively proving the malicious forgery, the calculated embezzlement, and the deliberate framing of an innocent man. It was a total slaughter. Clara had not just gathered memories, she had spent 15 agonizing years meticulously constructing an inescapable federal death trap for the man who had destroyed their family. She had gathered enough explosive legal power to instantly level Wallace's entire fraudulent real estate empire to the bare dirt. But the folder held one more astonishing secret. Tucked behind the heavy stacks of financial vouchers lay a large, heavy brown envelope. Arthur opened the metal clasp. He slowly pulled out a thick stack of wide, heavy drafting paper. His pale eyes widened in absolute silent shock. They were his drawings, 42 meticulously detailed, incredibly beautiful architectural and exclusive interior design schematics that he had personally drafted by hand in the quiet hours before his brutal arrest. They were the absolute pinnacle of his master craftsmanship. Attached to the heavy blueprints was a thick, officially sealed legal certificate. Arthur read the heavy black text. Before she passed away, his brilliant daughter Clara had officially registered and heavily copyrighted all 42 of his exclusive master designs. She had legally locked the immense intellectual property away inside an impenetrable, irrevocable trust fund, ensuring that no one, especially Wallace, could ever steal or exploit his life's work. He looked at the official beneficiary name printed at the bottom: Evelyn Pendleton. The old carpenter slowly lowered the heavy legal document onto the solid maple workbench. He placed his calloused hands flat against the cold wood, completely bowing his massive, heavy head in absolute, silent reverence. The women of his family had not been broken by the devastating cruelty of the world. They had fought back in the shadows, armed only with their unbreakable patience, their fierce intellect, and their boundless love, quietly building an empire of truth beneath the rotting floorboards of an abandoned woodshop. He was fully armed now. These trembling pieces of paper carried the immense, crushing weight of blood and tears, but when the highest legal experts would finally lay their eyes on these undeniable documents, they would know with absolute certainty that the countdown for the cold-blooded brothers' empire had already begun to tick.
Exactly 3 days later, the profound isolation of the old cedar woodshop was broken by the crunch of heavy tires. Arthur had walked 3 miles in the freezing wind to use a rusted public telephone outside a dilapidated gas station. He had made a single, carefully calculated phone call. He had reached out to a prestigious, fiercely independent law firm located 200 miles away in the city, demanding an immediate private consultation. 4 men stepped out of 2 sleek vehicles. They wore sharp, expensive wool suits and carried heavy leather briefcases. Stepping gingerly over the dead, frozen weeds, they entered the freezing, cavernous space of the woodshop, their polished leather shoes clicking softly against the pristine oak floorboards. Arthur did not offer them comfortable chairs. He did not offer them warm coffee. He simply pointed his scarred, calloused finger toward the massive maple workbench. The experts went to work. For 6 agonizing hours, the absolute only sound in the vast room was the crisp rustling of aged paper and the quiet, urgent whispers of the legal team. The lead federal attorney, a tall man with silver hair and incredibly sharp eyes, meticulously reviewed the fragile microfilm. He cross-referenced the original heavily stamped bank vouchers with the undeniable forged signatures of Wallace Pendleton. The attorney's hands actually trembled as he held up the undeniable proof of the elaborate, malicious setup. The evidence was absolute. "This is a federal slaughter," the lead attorney whispered in sheer awe. The state of Kentucky operated under a strict, unbreakable legal statute regarding cases of documented wrongful imprisonment. The undeniable proof of Wallace's perjury and massive financial manipulation instantly triggered an automatic, non-negotiable compensation mandate from the government. For the 20 years of freedom violently stolen from his life, the state was legally obligated to pay Arthur the maximum possible penalty: $4 million. But the financial earthquake did not stop there. The chief intellectual property appraiser, a man wearing thick glasses, carefully unrolled the 42 architectural blueprints under the harsh, bright glare of a portable halogen worklight. He studied the intricate hand-drawn lines. He admired the timeless proportions and the masterful, rugged integration of heavy timber and natural light. These were not just old, forgotten drawings, they were a revelation. In the current high-end real estate market across the country, Arthur's classic, heavily structured aesthetic had become an incredibly sought-after luxury trend. The appraiser looked up, his voice hushed with profound, absolute respect. "These copyrights are exclusive, perfectly registered, and entirely unassailable," he stated firmly. The estimated royalty valuation for licensing these exact designs to modern developers is staggering. We are looking at a minimum baseline of $2,400,000. Arthur did not smile. He did not pump his heavy fists in the air, and he did not shed tears of joyous relief. He simply stood there, wearing his faded denim jacket, his massive, heavily scarred arms crossed tightly over his broad chest. He absorbed the monumental numbers with the exact same freezing, impenetrable stoicism he had absorbed the $87 in the clear plastic prison bag. He was no longer a discarded convict. He was a millionaire. He held the absolute, terrifying power of a judging god in his battered hands, quietly standing on a mountain of legitimate wealth and lethal legal retribution. He thanked the men quietly, pulling a pen into his thick fingers, and signed the necessary legal representation agreements with a steady, heavy hand. But secrets of this massive magnitude could never stay buried for long. Within 48 hours, frantic whispers of the massive intellectual property valuation and the sudden aggressive mobilization of elite federal litigators began to leak through the deeply connected, wealthy circles of the state. The news hit Wallace Pendleton like a brutal physical blow. A cold, terrifying sweat broke immediately across Wallace's pampered, perfectly shaved face. His vast, fraudulent real estate empire was built entirely on a fragile foundation of lies, but his arrogant, blinding greed was a bottomless pit. He could not stand the agonizing thought of his ruined older brother holding a multi-million-dollar asset. He frantically convinced himself that the rotting woodshop property was still legally vulnerable. He made a fatal miscalculation. Driven by absolute blinding arrogance and a desperate need to maintain his complete dominance, the corrupt brother immediately assembled his own team of aggressive corporate lawyers, marching straight toward the dead end of Cedar Road to execute one final, despicable move. The heavy crunch of expensive rubber tires violently shattered the absolute silence of the afternoon. 3 sleek, black luxury vehicles violently tore down the overgrown dirt path of Cedar Road, completely ignoring the deep mud and the sharp, thorny weeds scraping against their pristine paint. They slammed to a halt just outside the heavy double doors of the woodshop. The temperature outside was a bitter 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but the air inside the black vehicles was perfectly climate-controlled. The heavy doors swung open. Out stepped Wallace Pendleton, surrounded immediately by a tight circle of 5 ruthless corporate attorneys wearing perfectly tailored silk suits. Wallace marched toward the open doors of the woodshop, a sickening, deeply rehearsed smile plastered across his pampered face. Inside, the vast cedar building was thick with the beautiful scent of fresh wood shavings and aged linseed oil. Arthur stood at the massive maple workbench, his faded denim jacket cast aside, wearing his thin cotton shirt. He was holding the heavy cast-iron block plane in his massive, scarred hands. He pushed the sharp steel blade across a rough beam of Douglas fir, his thick arm muscles driving the heavy tool forward with immense, unstoppable power. He did not stop. He did not look up. "Brother!" Wallace called out smoothly, his voice dripping with absolute sickening hypocrisy, loudly echoing off the high cedar rafters. "It has been far too long, Arthur. I heard the wonderful news about your sudden release. I came to see if you needed any help getting back on your feet." Arthur pulled the heavy plane back. He pushed it forward again, a perfect, paper-thin ribbon of pale wood curled gracefully into the air, falling onto the pile of shavings covering his heavy leather boots. He completely ignored the existence of the man standing just 10 feet away. Wallace's fake smile twitched, quickly souring into a sneer of pure, arrogant greed. He stepped forward, his polished leather shoes crunching loudly on the wood shavings, completely ruining the pristine order of the old master's workspace. "Let us drop the act, Arthur," Wallace demanded sharply, his voice dropping its friendly facade entirely.
I know exactly what you found hidden in this miserable pile of rotting garbage. My lawyers have already drafted the injunctions. This entire parcel of land is currently under a heavily disputed legal status regarding unresolved corporate liabilities from 20 years ago. Anything you found here, including those 42 architectural blueprints, belongs entirely to the Pendleton estate. He paused, adjusting his expensive silk tie. Which means they belong to me, Wallace stated coldly. The sound of the block plane finally stopped. Arthur slowly lifted his heavy, calloused hands off the cast-iron tool. He stood completely still, his massive, broad shoulders rising and falling with slow, powerful breaths. He turned his head ever so slightly, his pale eyes completely empty of anger, fear, or hatred. He simply looked at Wallace as if looking at a pathetic, dying insect. "Mr. Pendleton is entirely mistaken," a calm, deeply authoritative voice echoed from the dark shadows at the back of the shop. Wallace spun around rapidly, his eyes widening in sudden shock. Stepping out of the heavy gloom was Arthur's lead federal attorney, accompanied quietly by Evelyn. The lawyer walked confidently into the light, holding a thin, flimsy piece of official county paper. He extended his arm, displaying the document for Wallace's aggressive corporate lawyers to see clearly. "This land is not disputed," the attorney stated firmly, his voice cutting through the freezing air like a sharp blade. "Arthur Pendleton officially reclaimed absolute legal ownership of this entire property exactly 3 days ago. He paid the county administrative fee of $14 in cash. There are absolutely no corporate liabilities attached to this dirt." Wallace sneered, waving his soft hand dismissively. $14? Wallace laughed maliciously. "That is utterly pathetic. It does not matter. The intellectual property rights for those designs were drafted while he was employed by my company. I own them." "Wrong again," the attorney countered smoothly, pulling a heavy, officially sealed document from his leather briefcase. "The 42 master blueprints were never registered under your fraudulent corporation. They are legally bound within an irrevocable trust fund exclusively established by the late Clara Pendleton. The sole beneficiary is Evelyn Pendleton. You have absolutely zero legal claim to a single line of ink, nor the $2,400,000 they are currently worth." Wallace's face suddenly turned a sickly shade of pale gray. His greedy, arrogant eyes darted frantically toward his team of expensive lawyers, silently demanding a counterattack. But his attorneys were completely frozen, heavily intimidated by the absolute ironclad nature of the trust document. The massive financial victory had just slipped entirely through his greedy fingers. But the true punishment had not even begun. "However, we are not here to discuss blueprints today, Wallace." A new, incredibly deep voice boomed from the back room. The heavy door to the small storage closet swung open wide. 2 men stepped out into the main shop. They did not wear expensive silk suits. They wore heavy, dark windbreakers with 3 bold yellow letters printed across their broad chests. FBI. The lead federal agent walked directly toward Wallace. In his right hand, heavily protected inside a clear plastic evidence bag, he held the thick stack of fragile 20-year-old bank vouchers and the original unredacted loan agreements. He stopped exactly 2 feet from the trembling real estate tycoon. He held the documents directly in front of Wallace's face. Wallace stopped breathing. His perfectly pampered skin lost every single drop of blood, turning as white as a ghost. His eyes locked on to the bright blue fountain pen ink of his own forged signatures, perfectly matching the stolen millions from 20 years ago. The absolute, undeniable proof of his monumental betrayal, his malicious perjury, and his calculated destruction of an innocent man was staring him in the face. He was totally ruined. "Wallace Pendleton," the federal agent announced loudly, his voice carrying the crushing weight of absolute justice. "You are under arrest for massive federal fraud, grand embezzlement, and malicious perjury resulting in wrongful imprisonment. We have completely frozen every single bank account and seized every acre of real estate under your name. The agent reached down to his heavy-duty belt. The sharp, terrifying clink of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the quiet woodshop. Based on the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence provided, you are facing a mandatory federal sentence of exactly 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. 20 years, the exact same amount of time Arthur suffered in a miserable 6-by-8-foot concrete cell. The heavy steel cuffs clamped brutally tight over Wallace's expensive gold watch, biting deeply into his soft flesh. His knees suddenly gave out completely. He collapsed onto the cold oak floorboards, his expensive wool suit instantly covered in the thick, dusty wood shavings he had just mocked. "Arthur!" Wallace screamed hysterically, tears of pure terror pouring down his perfectly shaved face. "Please, you are my brother! Tell them it is a mistake! I cannot survive in there! Please!" He wailed like a pathetic, broken child. Arthur stood completely motionless at the heavy maple workbench. He did not smile. He did not show a single ounce of satisfaction, vengeance, or pity. He looked down at his massive, scarred hands. They were lightly dusted with pale, fine sawdust. He raised his hands slowly toward his face. He blew the sawdust off his palms. Arthur turned his broad back on his screaming, weeping brother, picked up his faded denim jacket, slung it slowly over his heavy shoulder, and began walking toward the open door of the woodshop, completely ignoring the desperate, agonizing screams fading rapidly behind him. Karma had come to collect its heavy debt. The deafening, pathetic wails of the traitor were violently cut off as the heavy doors of the police cruiser slammed completely shut in absolute humiliation, finally clearing the toxic air and returning the profound, beautiful silence to the ancient cedar woodshop, where the old master carpenter was quietly preparing his scarred hands to build one absolute, final masterpiece.
Exactly 1 year later, the harsh Kentucky winter had fully surrendered to a beautiful golden autumn. Arthur Pendleton was 73 years old. The $4 million of state compensation and the $2,400,000 of intellectual property royalties did not purchase a sprawling estate, a fleet of luxury vehicles, or a life of idle, pampered comfort. Arthur had absolutely no use for the shallow, empty trappings of the wealthy elite. Instead, he poured the massive fortune directly into the 3 acres of dirt at the dead end of Cedar Road. The rotting, sagging structure was completely reborn. He had replaced the ruined exterior siding with premium, weather-resistant cedar planks, heavily reinforced the massive Douglas fir roof trusses, and expanded the original footprint by 2,000 square feet. The vast, beautifully illuminated space was now officially christened the Martha and Clara American Craftsmanship Academy. It was a completely free, rigorously disciplined sanctuary designed specifically for the troubled, discarded youth of Blackwood County. A place to forge broken, forgotten children into strong, capable men through the silent, honest religion of physical labor. The temperature outside was a perfectly mild 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the shop, the air smelled intoxicatingly of sweet pine, rich mahogany, and fresh linseed oil. The golden light of the late afternoon sun bled perfectly through the large, pristine glass windows, casting long, warm shadows across the immaculate oak floorboards. Arthur stood quietly at the heart of the massive room, his broad chest covered by a thick, heavy canvas apron deeply coated in pale wood shavings. He was not alone. Standing right beside his heavy leather boots was his great-grandson, little Leo, who had just turned 4 years old. Arthur knelt heavily onto the oak floorboards. He reached out with his massive, deeply scarred hands, gently wrapping his thick, calloused hands completely around the tiny, soft hands of the young boy.
together, they gripped the heavy, smooth ash wood handle of a beautifully polished brass block plane. "Hold it steady," Arthur murmured gently, his deep voice carrying a profound, quiet warmth. They leaned forward together. They pushed the razor-sharp steel blade smoothly across the pristine surface of a solid mahogany board. A perfect, incredibly thin ribbon of sweet-smelling wood curled gracefully out of the heavy iron throat, falling softly onto the boy's tiny work boots. Leo laughed brightly, a sound so pure and completely untainted that it instantly chased away the very last lingering shadow of the past 2 decades. Arthur looked up from the heavy maple workbench. The warm, golden rays of the setting sun slowly drifted across the back wall of the woodshop, illuminating a custom-built, heavily protected glass frame hanging in a place of absolute honor. Inside the heavy glass rested a fragile, torn piece of yellow legal paper. The bright light beautifully highlighted the violently jagged, trembling blue ink that painstakingly spelled out his name, the absolute, undeniable proof of a love that had defied a stroke, defied crippling poverty, and defied time itself. He was finally home. From exactly 87 miserable dollars carried in a clear plastic prison bag to a sprawling empire of truth, the old master carpenter had proven an absolute, unshakable law of the universe. Evil men can violently steal your physical wealth, and they can mercilessly lock your aging body in a cage of iron and steel for 20 agonizing years. But quiet, unbreakable endurance and immortal, unconditional love will always remain the only weapons capable of carving a legacy that can never be destroyed.